Thank you, Julie. Great to see a lot of familiar faces and names and new ones as well. Great to be with you today. What a joy to study Torah with people around the country and world, regardless of what's happening around us. It's good that we can hunker down and be supported by Torah. So as Julie said, this week we begin the book of Shemot, book of Exodus. And just like that, really in a dizzyingly fast literary pace, in just the span of a couple of verses, the fate of the people of Israel changes dramatically. It's so ingrained in our consciousness now to remember the Exodus, remember slavery, to think of Egypt as the house of slavery, because our liturgy refers to it that way so much. And it's hard to remember sometimes that about half of the period of time we lived in Egypt was very good times. Just last week, we saw Yaakov, Jacob and sons and family arrive in Egypt because they were famine refugees, be welcomed by the regime, be allowed to have land of their own so they could practice their culturally specific practices. They weren't told, learn Egyptian and assimilate and be like the rest of us. They were allowed to speak their language, do their practices on their own, in their own space. They were really welcomed, really a model of how a powerful regime can welcome refugees. And we know that the famine only lasted 7 years, from Yosef's interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams, and a couple of years into that, the Israelites arrived. But after 5, 6, 7 years, they didn't leave and go back to Canaan. They stayed. You might think, well, they were reunited with Yosef. Yosef couldn't leave. Yaakov dies. They go up, the whole entourage, to the land of Israel to bury him, but they all come back. Life was pretty good in Mitzrayim. Yosef dies. The people still stay. They were successfully integrated, having a good time. So how do we move from being a favored minority group, successfully integrated into a prosperous country, to being slaves? What are the mechanics of how that happens? In the blink of an eye, we might miss it in this week's Parsha if we don't pay attention. So we are going to draw our attention in our 45 minutes this morning to the mechanics of oppression. How does a tyrant actually successfully shift one minority group from being favored by the whole country into being slaves? What are the mechanics of how that happens? So I'm going to share a screen. Also, Julie has put the link to the document, which is available to see in the chat. So you can open it in a different form if that is your preference. Second. Okay, the politics of oppression. Pharaoh's tactics to move the Israelites from protected minority to slaves. So we're going to wonder what bothered the king about the Israelites. If nothing bothered kings for, 190 years or whatever, the Israelites were a welcomed part of Egyptian society. What bothered the king now? Why did he change a long-standing Egyptian policy toward the Israelites? And how did he get a nation that has long welcomed an immigrant group to turn on them? So let's do a careful read of Shemot, Exodus chapter 1. I'm going to read in English. It's my translation. I consult a lot with other translations, but I have little bones to pick with everybody's translation in different ways. It's important for a facilitator to share their biases. Instinctively, I'm drawn to Robert Alter's translation of the Torah. I like his literary sense. I think he has a good ear to the text, to translating in a way that captures alliteration and the feel of words. But sometimes he's a a little dismissive of philology and critical scholarship. The Jewish Publication Society translation is probably in certain ways the best in that regard, but in my opinion is very disregarding of literary cues. So I try to, it's a kind of a Robert Alterian translation with some emendations. Okay, so here we are. The first 5 verses of the book of Shemot just recapitulate the names of Yaakov's family who came down to Egypt. Now the story picks up in verse 6. And Yosef died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and swarmed and multiplied and became very, very vast, so that the land was filled with them. And a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Yosef. And he said to his people, look, the Israelite people is more numerous and vast than we. Come, let us outsmart it, lest it multiply. And then, should war occur, even join our enemies and fight against us and go up from the land. So they set forced labor masters over them so as to abuse them with their burdens. And they built store cities for Paro, Pitom, and Ramses. But the more they abused them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out. So they loathed the Israelites. And Egypt worked the Israelites crushingly, and they embittered their lives with hard work, with mortar and bricks, and with all sorts of work in the fields. All their work, which they set them to work, crushingly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrews' midwives, one of whom was named Shifra, and the second of whom was named Puah, saying, when you birth the Hebrews, look on the birth stool. If it is a boy, then kill him, but if it is a girl, she should live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as spoken to them by the king of Egypt, but they kept the children alive. So the king of Egypt called to the midwives and said to them, why did you do this thing, keeping the children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, not like Egyptian women are the Hebrews. They're lively. Before the midwife arrives, they've already given birth. And God made good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very vast. And so, since the midwives feared God, he made them houses. Pharaoh commanded his whole people, saying, every son who is born, throw him into the river, but every daughter you should keep alive. So that's a pretty rapid escalation. I mean, we escalated from a favored, totally integrated, successful minority group to being subjected into a forced labor abuse situation just in 5 verses, from verse 6 to 11. And in another 11 verses, we have a partial genocide against their babies. So how did that happen? Mechanically, how? What were politically, how? What were the tools in which that occurred? We have very few cues here. All we have, we're really going to focus on verses 8 to 10. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Yosef. And then verses 9 and 10, he said to his people, look, the Israelite people is more numerous and vast than we. Come, let us outsmart it, lest it multiply, and then should war occur, even join our enemies and fight against us and go up from the land. Let's focus on verse 8. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Yosef. And let's try to unpack that and understand who this king is politically, so that we can maybe understand the motivations and why he looks at Hebrew fertility and presence in Egypt so differently than his predecessors did. So let's take a minute, and you can either in the chat or use the raise your hand function. I'll stop the share screen for a moment. If you want to share some theories as to what is anything you notice in verse 8, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Yosef. Anything you notice about that literarily that strikes you that might give you a theory about who this king is politically. Let's hear from Carrie Hillebrand and then Esther Westelman.
Yeah, hi. Well, actually, I think the answer is in the previous chapter. Joseph used his privilege of position to affect the whole re-engineering of Egyptian society, effectively reducing them from landowning peasants to landless serfs. Now, the new king, the new pharaoh, may not have known Joseph, but the people themselves, they remembered the fact that the position. They maybe didn't remember that he saved them from the famine, but he remembered how he changed their status. And I think that having a new pharaoh that wasn't sympathetic to Joseph, it was now sort of a payback time.
Great. So Carrie is mentioning that there are other details I'm skipping over at the very end of Breshit. The stage is set for the Hebrews to be separated. In fact, the medieval French commentator, the Bechor Shor, notes that, the Israelites might have even had favored status compared to the other Egyptians, because all the Egyptians had to go and they use language of servitude, like sell themselves to the finance minister, to Yosef, whereas the Hebrews, his family, were just supported. And so that might have been, as often happens, anti-Semitism, that rulers who talk as though they're giving the Jewish people special treatment. The Jews are our special friend, and that in the Jewish community reacts as though that means we're being given better treatment, when actually that's setting them up to be scapegoats. And maybe that happened there. And the Bechor Shor notices that, there was a certain kind of comeuppance happening there. Thank you, Carrie. Esther, go ahead.
To me, the word yada doesn't only mean to know, but to be aware.
Mm-hmm.
The new Pharaoh was aware of the political situation that he is in. He is surrounded by all kinds of nations that are a threat to him, and therefore it's logical that he'd be afraid that the Israelites, because they are so numerous, would join the enemy. So for me, the word yada is to be aware more than to just know.
So you're saying he was aware of their, what was he aware of and what was he not aware of?
No, he said, lo yada, did not know.
Right.
So to me, it's not that he didn't know, but he became aware of the political situation of the time. And
but you're reading it as though it says that he did know. The Torah says, lo yada, at Yosef.
Lo yada, he chose not to know. It's a generation after the death of the tribes, right? So he didn't know those people, but he did know, he was aware of what was going on, and therefore he acted the way he did.
Get it. So that dovetails nicely with what Carrie said, that in other words, things have happened in terms of the change of the Israelite people and the change of the political status of the Egyptians. There's stuff to know going on. And the only thing that interrupts hostility to the Israelites is this favorable recognition based on the personal relationship with Yosef and family. As soon as you take that away, Yosef is gone, his generation is gone, his kids are gone, then they're just this large immigrant group with special treatment. So there's a certain, perhaps, inevitability to it. So that's great background. I want to look at another element to join, not to contradict, but to add onto that. So I'm going to share a screen again to add a little bit more about cues. Both Carrie and Esther very correctly noticed this unusual phrase, Asher lo yada et Yosef, who did not know Yosef. I want to focus already in the beginning of the verse. A new king arose over Egypt. Vayakom melech chadash al Mitzrayim. What does that mean? Now, the Talmud already has a machloket, a dispute, about the meaning of that verse. Masechet Sotah, Vayakom melech chadash, a new king arose. Rav and Shmuel, these the classic Babylonian first generation sages, 3rd century, one of them said that Melech Chadash, new king, means actually new, Chadash Mamash. The other one said No, it wasn't a new king. It's just Shenitchadshu Gzerotav, whose decrees were issued anew. The existing king changed policy. That might sound surprising. So the Gemara explains the one who said actually new explains the reason, because it says new. The Torah knows Hebrew, that's what it means. The one who said it's because the decrees were issued anew. In other words, an existing king looked at things differently, changed policy, is noticing an anomaly in the verse. It doesn't say Vayamot Vayimloch, so-and-so died and so-and-so ruled. In order to understand that interpretation, let's look at another of the several biblical passages that narrate royal succession. So this is Breshit chapter 36, which is the text like this that we've most recently read, that goes through Esav's descendants. And this is typical biblical language for narrating the passing of generations in a royal succession. We see this in the book of Kings as well. These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned for the Israelites. Bela ben Beor reigned in Edom, and the name of the city was Dinhava. And Bela died, and Yovav ben Zerach from Botzra reigned in his place. And Yovav died, and Husham from the land of the Yemenite reigned in his place, etc., etc., etc. Vayimloch, so-and-so, Vayamot, so-and-so, Vayimloch tachtav, so-and-so. So-and-so reigned, Melecht, so-and-so died, and so-and-so Yimloch in his place. So the usual verb describing the beginning of a regime is Vayimloch, from the verb form of the word Melech, king. And here, though, it doesn't say, we don't hear Vayamot Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt died, Vayimloch tachtav, and reigned in his place somebody else. We don't hear a succession in that way. So what is the semantic valence of the verb Vayakom al Mitzrayim? A new king arose over Egypt. I want to look at a few other verses in the Tanakh that use that phrase, the word Vayakom, or especially Vayakom al, to arise over, to understand the literary valence of that term in the Tanakh. Most famously, in the Midbar chapter 16, we have the most infamous rebellion, wicked rebellion against Moshe and God. Korach, son of Yitzhar, son of Kahat, son of Levi, took up along with Datan and Abiram, sons of Eliab and On, sons of Pelet, sons of Reuven, and they arose before Moshe. Vayakumu lifnei Moshe. Now there it's not Vayakumu al, but they arose over it, Vayakumu lifnei, before, but still that is part of our echo of the word Vayakumu. Similarly, in a legal text, Devarim chapter 22, we find, if a man finds a betrothed young woman in the field and the man seizes her and lays her, then only the man lying with her shall die. The case of a rape. But to the young woman you shall do nothing. The young woman bears no capital offense, because it's like as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so is this thing. Yakum ish al re'ehu. It's like a man rising. You have that same phrase. Yakum al is a phrase used for describing the setup for a murder. The book of Job similarly says, the murderer arises in the evening to kill the poor and needy, and at night he acts the thief. Or Yakum Rotzeach. Psalm 27, which we recite all throughout the month of Elul, leading up to Rosh Hashanah, and then through Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. Do not turn me over to the clutches of my tormentors, for false witnesses and unjust accusers have arisen against me. Ki kamuvi edei sheker. So we see the valence of the word lakum, to arise, is often in the Tanakh to arise threateningly, to not to just achieve a position of prominence, but to achieve dangerous, threatening, murderous power. and especially with Yakum Al, that's specifically the preparation for murder. So it's a very ominous phrase in many places in the Tanakh, and that is how the Torah here describes the change of power. We never hear what happened to the old king. Just a new king arose over Egypt. And in light of that, the Ibn Ezra, one of the classic medieval commentators to the Torah, says, the explanation is like the plain meaning without addition. He was not from the seed of the dynastic kingship. Therefore, it is written, arose like, and he quotes another verse that I should have brought but didn't, in the book of Shmuel, my son has raised up my servant to lie in wait against me. Another Hakim Beniel of the Alai. So there's a context for actually using the root lakum al in the context of a coup. That's King Shaul, King Saul, paranoid, thinking that his son Yonatan is setting up David to stage a coup against Shaul. And so Ibn Ezra's interpretation is that this king came to power via a coup. He's not recognized by the full nation in his dynastic power. Again, also notice, who is he, Vayakom al? Not just that he seized power in perhaps a violent and aggressive way, it's Vayakom al Mitzrayim. It's not just Vayakom al Ha'ivrim or al Bnei Yisrael. New king arose over the Israelites, over Egypt. Maybe he achieved the throne in Egypt in a way that many Egyptians viewed as hostile. So we might have a king who has achieved the throne in a hostile way and is not necessarily, doesn't have a stable perception of the legitimacy of his throne by the entire people. And I want to note, while we were discussing this before, the time Carrie and Esther commented, we did have one comment from Susan Cohen-Lackman. If you scroll back, this king is not part of the previous dynasty. So very good perceptiveness to that linguistic cue and anticipating the Ibn Ezra. So yeah, we have a couple of, there's a question. Lior asks, do we know which pharaoh this is? And Avril says the Hyksos dynasty started around this time. Earlier in the 20th century, there was a lot of scholarship trying to locate the story of the Israelites and the dynastic pharaoh with a specific regime at a specific time. That kind of scholarship has fallen out of favor because the scholarship now typically understands this more as a typological mythic story. The author is not trying to link to a particular person at a particular time, but to link to themes that were recognizable. There were shifts in dynasties in Egypt. There were coups, and notice that our biblical author, whether you see that with a lowercase or a capital A, doesn't even try to name the king. Like the biblical author just says Melech Mitzrayim here, the king of Egypt, and later we'll use Pharaoh as though that's a name, as opposed to just the Egyptian word for king. So now scholarship has become more modest in saying, like, we have a folk tale that could be located in lots of different times in history. There's more to say about that, but I think we'll leave it at that for now. Howard Marks, I see there's a hand. Let me go ahead.
Yeah, Rabbi, thank you. I think if you read on, I think the next verse puts this whole thing in the context that the Israelites would become a fifth column within Egypt, and talks in very martial military terms of joining up with the enemies that this new regime had, which I think underscores what you just said, that basically this was a violent overthrow or coup of the existing dynasty. And that's what arose probably means. So I think it's really tied into the upcoming the upcoming verses.
Great, thank you, Howard. So let's turn our attention to the upcoming verses. Now that we have a sense of who this king might have been politically, that the Torah is signaling to us in a very deft, subtle cues, but pretty clear cues if we're sensitive to biblical language, that this is not a regular regime change. When we say like a new king, we really mean that there's been a political rupture, and a political leader who's not seen as legitimate probably by a lot of the Egyptians. What do political leaders do when they are not necessarily seen as legitimate by many of the people in their country? What are the mechanisms that they're going to do in order to secure more legitimate? Luke comments create an outgroup. It's certainly something we've seen here in the United States, we've seen in Europe, we've seen, people on this call are various ages. We've seen it in the lifespan of everybody on this call and throughout history. Let's actually see some of the mechanisms of how the Torah communicates that happens. I'm going to share screen again. And so let's preparing the ground for slavery. Again, if we're finding out that this king achieved the throne not through normal methods, but through rigging the system in some way, some sort of coup that put him in office in a way that was not seen as legitimate by everybody, that actually makes it harder to understand how he was able to change the fortunes of a people who's been welcomed for a long time. I could more understand it if it's a very popular king decides to change a policy. How did the king achieve this? So why did this new king turn on them? We've now begun to understand. Somebody just commented in the comment that creating an outgroup is a way to consolidate the remainder together to create a new kind of nationalism that is represented by this inauthentic king. What we saw in our verse is in verse 9, so the next thing, once he comes to power, he said to his people, look, Hine, the Israelite people is more numerous and vast than we. Come, let us outsmart it, lest it multiply, and then should war occur, even join our enemies and fight against us and go up from the land. Now, I want to think about the mechanics of that. He said to his people. What does that mean? Did he convene a whole national gathering where all people in the Egyptian empire were required to gather around the palace? It took weeks and weeks and months to convene everybody, get there from the vast Egyptian empire. And then once they get there, his speech is one sentence, two sentences, and then he sends everybody home. What does it mean he said to his people? How do you capture something that quickly? This was before Twitter. What's the context here? How does he actually go about this? So I think it has to imply a campaign, a repeat, getting the message out in a lot of different ways. The king communicated to his people in a lot of different ways. And I want to look with you at a passage that should be very familiar to many people on this call, but is very easy to overlook. It took me into my 40s before I really noticed it. And that was just because I read a commentary. Let's look at how the Pesach Haggadah subtly explains this verse. So remember, the main body of the Maggid storytelling section of the Pesach Haggadah is to unpack, do midrash on Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 26, which is a kind of a concise retelling of our national story. So a perishing Aramean was my father, and he went down to Egypt and was a migrant there with a few people, and there he became a large, mighty, and developed nation. And the Egyptians did us evil, and abused us and set upon us hard labor. We cried out to Adonai, the God of our ancestors, and Adonai heard our voice, saw our abuse and our toil and our oppression. And Adonai brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand, with an outstretched arm, with great terror, with signs, with wonders. Now, if we stop there and don't read what the Haggadah says yet, and if we were to imagine we have to do midrash that just explains, unpacks what is meant by every clause, what would we assume is meant by Vayareu otanu hamitzrim, verse 6, the Egyptians did us evil? Every time I've ever taught this passage, and I ask that question, everybody says one of two answers. Either the slavery itself, or, the decree to kill Hebrew babies. Seems like the two most evil things that were done to us, the obvious low-hanging fruit. However, the Haggadah interprets it very differently. The Haggadah, its midrash on this little clause, is the Egyptians did us evil, as it is stated, connected to our verse, Shemot 1:10. Come, let us outsmart it, lest it multiply. And then should war occur, actually join our enemies and fight against us and go up from the land. What does one thing have to do with the other? It's very strange. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. In rabbinic language, for those who are accustomed to studying the Talmud, dvarim ba'alma. These are mere words that the king said. Why are we interpreting in the concise story of our oppression the phrase the Egyptians did us evil as a speech that the king gave? Mere words. Why aren't we focusing on the actions? Or why don't we exclusively focus on the actions, as the Haggadah will do with the following phrases? Abused us is the forced separation of spouses, set upon us hard labor. That's the labor regime. Later on, they'll interpret what the killing of babies. But why is the Haggadah insisting that a speech of the king or a campaign of the king was such a big deal? Let the king rant. This isn't even a popular king. What's the big deal? I'll stop the share for a minute and take a couple of responses to that, and then we'll look at some commentaries. Let's hear Noreen Freeman.
Well, I don't know if this goes along with what you're asking, but a couple of things. First of all, I think the earlier king may not have been an Egyptian, may have been one of those Hyksos things, a Canaanite kind of thing, and would be a little more accessible to what the Israelites had to offer. And the new king may have been, once they threw out the Hyksos, may have been the Egyptian, who then took over, and the hatred came from him. That's how it seemed to have started. And he didn't have to convince anybody. He's a king. He's an absolute ruler. But Aviva Zornberg suggests that the people became so numerous, and it was a little bit on them that they didn't perpetuate their ideas, their uniqueness, their specialness, their goodness, whatever. They didn't perpetuate what Joseph had done.
Great.
And that...
Thank you. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Fed into the problem, that the king was able to overturn a lot of maybe positive ideas about the people because he didn't acknowledge, not that he didn't know or wasn't aware, he didn't acknowledge it, and he didn't have to, because the Israelites didn't put it forward.
Thanks, Noreen. So you're bringing us back to help fill out our earlier, what we discussed a little while ago about the mechanisms of why this king didn't know Yosef and what's bothering him and what his political position is. That's great. So where we are now in terms of what the mechanisms of a campaign of hate, how in this one verse, two verses, how is it happening that that he succeeds in sinking the Israelites into slavery? How does slavery actually happen? we're wondering why the Haggadah is translating the phrase "did evil to us" in such a bizarre way. I'll come back to that in a second. I'm noticing some comments in some questions in the comments too. Sherry asked, like, what about referring to the Israelites as it, not them, removing the human element? And Carrie responded, there's no it in Hebrew. The correct translation is them. Correct is a complicated word, Carrie. All translation is always missing something. Let me get to the bottom of that a little bit. I think, Sherry, where Carrie's right is that I would be cautious at reading too much dehumanization into it, because where Carrie's right is that in Hebrew, there's no distinction between him or her and it. There's no separate, but there is a distinction between singular and plural. Most translations render it them. One of the reasons I break from most translations here, it is intentional, is because this is the first time that Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, are made into a nation. The beginning of the nationhood of the Jewish people is this campaign, this hate campaign by this cooed king. And I think rendering it in the singular is really important. And I'm willing to, I think it's closer to accurate to say there's a dehumanization, to imply there's a dehumanization, which might not be there in the Hebrew, than to keep them and miss the fact that he's doing something very deft at treating them in the singular. Whereas before, there were multiple descendants of an actual person. Yisrael was a person whose name was Yisrael. Jacob's name also was Yisrael. Bnei Yisrael means the children of this actual guy. And now this new illegitimate king treats them as a singular unit. So that's why I kept the it there, because if I rendered it as him, it's the masculine singular object word, then that would be inscrutable. Like, who is it talking about? In terms of the question of perishing Aramean, wandering Aramean, scholars, go back. Oved is an unusual word, means to get lost. It also can mean on the way to death. Different translators and commentators render it different ways. I think perishing is probably a little more likely than wandering. Wandering can also imply just like curiosity and exploration, and this word is definitely implying, getting lost in some way. Okay, so Jennifer commented, did us evil, could it mean attributing to the Israelites malicious intentions? So let's actually turn our attention back to the text here. Very sensitive read. And I think what the cue to that, the Hebrew is Vayareu Otanu Hamitzrim. So the root of Vayareu is Ra, wicked, evil, and this is the causative plural form. Mitzrayim is the subject, the Egyptians. Otanu, et is the pivot word before a direct object in Hebrew. And you're sensitively pointing out that really it doesn't say they did evil unto us. It says they eviled us. Vayareu otanu. They were direct objects, not objects of a prepositional phrase. It's a little hard to render in the English, but it really comes into relief when you notice the almost identical phrase in a parallel different passage talking about our Egyptian experience in the book of Bamidbar, chapter 20, when Moshe sends messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom asking for safe passage. So says your brother Israel, you know all the travail that has found us, how our ancestors went down to Egypt. We lived in Egypt many days. And the Egyptians did evil to us and to our ancestors. Vayareu lanu Mitzrayim. The Egyptians did evil to us, lanu. That probably implies, slavery, killing babies, and everything. The Torah knows how to say that. Vayareu lanu. And here it says in Devarim, Vayareu otanu. And what the Netziv, other commentaries as well, the early modern commentary of the Netziv notices that, makes the same observation that Jennifer did. that Steve studied in Jennifer's yeshiva, and says the Haggadah raises that the meaning is not that they made our lives bad, for if so, it would have had to say they did evil to us, vayareu lanu. Instead, it is they did us evil, vayareu otanu. They made us out to be evil and ingrates until they suspected us, and then said, let's multiply and join our enemies, which is weird. There's no indication that this minority group is a fifth column. Like, what was the grounds for that? And what the Haggadah is doing, this is very important. It's so subtle. It's easy to miss it. I missed it at my Seders for over 40 years. What the Haggadah is doing here is telling us that if we're going to boil down our story to just a couple of, really a few simple elements, it is imperative to highlight that one of the elements of our oppression was mere speech. The PR campaign, the defamation campaign is a critical part of the story. And that forces us to imagine that probably when this illegitimate king, who as illegitimate kings usually do from our experience, come and try to secure their hold on the throne by ginning up a new kind of nationalism by designating an outgroup and starting a campaign against them, a caravan of Hebrew, whatever it's going to be. When a leader does that, there are probably going to be some moderates in the people who say, oh, this guy is a creep, this guy's a fool, is an idiot, but it's just speech. Stop trying to exaggerate. It's not that bad. Things are okay here. Why do you radicals have to be exaggerating so much? Just call them Nazis. Come on, you're really over the top. It's just speech. He hasn't done anything yet. He hasn't committed a final solution yet. He hasn't killed babies yet. We should wait until that all happens before we complain about it. And what the Haggadah is telling us, that the Torah is telling us, is absolutely not. That is wrong. What we have to do is recognize the defamation of minorities, turning favored minorities into being a scapegoat, is an act of war. It is integral. There is no possibility of having slavery without having that defamation campaign. The Hebrews were successfully integrated. And the Ramban, we'll close with this, the Ramban really wants us to understand this well. When he says, let us outsmart it, Pharaoh and his advisors didn't see fit to smite them with the sword, because that would be a great betrayal, to smite a nation that has come to the land on the command of the first king. Even the common people wouldn't give consent to the king to do such a crime, for he consults with them. And additionally, the nation of Israel was numerous and mighty and would fight back in a great war. Rather, he advised that they should act cleverly so that Israel should not feel he's acting out of hate, etc., etc., etc. I want to remind us of that. What the Torah is reminding us in this week's Parsha is that defamation campaigns really matter. That if a regime plants articles in its favored media outlets, ginning up fears about a certain racial group and exaggerate to make everybody now in a sleight of hand think that we're living in a time of rising crime. Just the other day, I was on the L in Chicago, and a woman was like, well, she's probably in her 60s. My husband now doesn't want me to walk around outside because the crime, it's worse than ever. Now, the data are very clear. Crime is lower than it's been in decades. This woman was alive in the late 60s. This woman is alive in the late 80s. Crime in Chicago and in cities across America was much, much higher. We have clear, unequivocal data about that. What has made her feel and made her husband feel that there's higher crime today? That is the result of perhaps illegitimate regimes ginning up through their favored media outlets fears of others and outsiders in order to break down political opposition to cruel and despotic regimes. That's what happens. It happens repeatedly, and our Parsha is telling us, and our Parshanim and our Chachamim are telling us that is a major part of the story. And when people complain about this regime when he's just doing the ad campaign and getting on Egyptian media to spread disinformation, anybody who says this is a crisis, this is a Nazi leader, is doing the right thing. And anybody, the moderates who say, oh, come on, why do you have to be so extreme? They are unwitting capitulators to a later slavery. No matter how aggressive a king is, he will not be able to just go start out of the blue killing people. Even people who are kind of racist won't stand for it. Even people who didn't care about the Hebrews that much or resented them are not going to stand for the king just going and killing babies. The king has got to escalate to that. And the king is not willing to waste political capital until he really has to. First, he tries to turn the people against them. Then he tries to buy off the midwives. They resist, a great act of political resistance, putting themselves at risk. Finally, he's willing to spend the political capital to actually impose a regime. Had verse 9 and 10 not happened, it wouldn't have been successful. And our job is to counter racist rhetoric wherever it comes, to stand in solidarity with minorities and with people who are targeted by despotic regimes, who are serving not us, but themselves and their illegitimate holds on power when they try to turn minority groups in the populations against each other. That is what the Torah is teaching us this week. Shabbat Shalom, and I'll turn it back to Julie.